Hey there, friend. Tonight, we're stepping into a darker corner of the past. Not the battles you've read about in history books, not the grand stories of kings and castles, but the stories whispered by firelight of men and women whose cruelty earned them a place in memory, long after their bones turned to dust. This journey is about those who walked among their neighbors with smiling faces, and yet carried secrets in their hearts so black that the ground itself seemed to recoil. We're talking about the serial killers of medieval times. Now, don't worry, you're not here to be shocked or unsettled. You're here to drift. This is a calm telling, a slow unraveling of old crimes, a history so strange that it keeps your mind gently occupied, but soft enough to let your body rest. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been with me before, welcome back. I like to imagine where you might be listening, maybe in a city apartment where car lights flicker across the walls, or in a quiet farmhouse where the only sound outside is the wind. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you've joined me tonight. And if this kind of candlelit history helps you find rest, feel free to subscribe, because there are many more nights and many more stories ahead. So let's begin. Picture yourself in a medieval village. It's evening and the fields are quiet. Smoke rises from chimneys and the smell of cooking drifts on the air. Neighbors talk at their doorways. Children chase one another in the mud. On the surface, life feels safe, ordinary. But beneath that ordinary rhythm lies something darker. Because the truth is, even in the centuries we like to imagine as simple and innocent, there were killers, not knights with swords on battlefields, but men and women who hunted their victims in secret, hiding in plain sight. The Middle Ages did not have the words we use today: serial killer, psychopath, criminal profile. What they had instead was rumor, suspicion, confession under torture, and execution in the town square. But if you look closely, you can see the same patterns we recognize now: repeat offenses, ritual, compulsion. These people were as human as we are, with urges that twisted into something monstrous. And what makes it more chilling is that, in a medieval world, life was already so fragile. Death was everywhere: plague, famine, war, and yet the figures we'll meet tonight were not satisfied with that. They carved their own path of blood through villages and cities, and the echo of their deeds has lingered for centuries. One of the earliest and most notorious was Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman and companion of Joan of Arc. To his neighbors, he was wealthy, cultured, a man of standing, but behind the walls of his castles, children disappeared, drawn in by promises of food or gold, only to meet horrors too grim to name. His trial in 1440 shocked Europe, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because they shattered the illusion that nobility meant virtue. Then there was Peter Stumpp, the so-called Werewolf of Bedburg in 16th century Germany. A farmer by day, he confessed under brutal interrogation to a life of cannibalism, murder, and unspeakable acts, claiming he prowled the countryside in the skin of a wolf. Was he truly a beast? Or was the werewolf merely the cloak the villagers used to make sense of his crimes? Either way, his story became legend, and we'll wander even further to Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess of Hungary, accused of bathing in the blood of young girls to preserve her beauty. Whether she was guilty of all the charges, or whether her enemies twisted truth into nightmare, her name has become inseparable from cruelty. These are only the beginnings, the shadows we'll walk through tonight. But before we dive into each tale, I want you to settle into the rhythm. Take a breath, feel the room around you grow quieter. Imagine the soft glow of a candle, the way its flame wavers when you breathe near it. Outside the window, picture a dark forest, branches creaking in the night wind. In the silence, imagine footsteps, slow, deliberate. This is the mood of our journey. We're not rushing, we're not turning these lives into spectacle. We are unfolding them carefully, like yellowed pages in an old book, one by one. Tonight, you'll hear of men who hid in forests, of women who lured victims into kitchens, of nobles who killed beneath painted ceilings, And as you listen, you may realize something chilling. Human cruelty does not belong to one era. It follows us, century after century, wearing new faces but driven by the same shadow. So let's walk together into this history. The fire is warm, the night is long, and the stories are waiting. The first figure in our candlelit journey is Gilles de Rais, a man whose life looked, at first, like the story of a hero. Born into nobility in Brittany in 1405, he grew up among castles, servants, and the privileges of rank. His family's estates stretched across western France, their banners flying proudly in the wars of the day. Gilles himself was strikingly intelligent, charming, and ambitious. From an early age, he seemed destined for greatness, and greatness did come, or at least the illusion of it. As a young man, Gilles rode beside none other than Joan of Arc, fighting to lift the siege of Orléans and to place Charles VII on the French throne. He was one of her most loyal captains, carrying his sword into battle, leading men with courage and fire. In those moments, he was celebrated as a national hero, a shining example of knightly honor. He was rewarded handsomely by the king, lands, wealth, titles. For a time, Gilles de Rais was among the most admired men in France. But once Joan was gone, once her flame had been snuffed out on the pyre at Rouen, Gilles began to drift. He withdrew from battlefields and court life, retreating instead to his castles. And behind those stone walls, something in him began to unravel. He spent lavishly staging plays and pageants that swallowed fortunes, filling his halls with extravagance until his coffers ran dry. And when the gold was gone, something darker emerged. It began quietly, with whispers of missing children. Peasant families would report a son who never returned from an errand, a daughter who vanished while fetching water. At first, no one dared to accuse a nobleman. To speak ill of Gilles de Rais was dangerous. But the whispers grew, and the pattern became harder to ignore. Children entered his estates, but never left. The truth, as later revealed in his trial, was monstrous. Gilles lured children with gifts of food, clothing, or coins, often sending his servants to entice them. Once inside, they were never seen again. Testimonies painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty, killings carried out not in rage, but ritualistically with a perverse hunger that defies comprehension. Some accounts spoke of dozens of victims, others hundreds. The exact number is lost to history, but even the lowest estimates make him one of the most prolific killers of all time. What makes Gilles de Rais so haunting is the contrast. The knight who fought beside Joan of Arc, remembered as a holy figure, now accused of crimes so dark that they seemed almost supernatural. His reputation shattered and his name spread in fear. Parents warned their children with a tale of a nobleman who devoured the innocent, and over time his story merged with the legend of Bluebeard, the wealthy man with the forbidden chamber full of corpses. His downfall came not only because of his crimes, but also because of his reckless spending. Bankrupt and desperate, he quarreled with the church, seizing property and threatening clergy. That was a mistake. The church moved swiftly, and Gilles was arrested in 1440. His trial became one of the most infamous of the century. In the courtroom, he confessed under pressure to everything, luring, killing, desecrating. He wept, sometimes with regret, sometimes with the strange detachment of a man already consumed by his own darkness. Witnesses came forward, parents of missing children, servants who had seen too much. Piece by piece, the mask of the noble knight fell away, revealing something closer to a nightmare. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was executed in Nantes. The method was hanging, followed by burning, a double assurance that this man, once called hero, would trouble the world no more. Crowds gathered to watch, their faces torn between grief for their lost children and awe that a man of such high birth had been brought so low. Yet even in his death, contradictions remained. Some chroniclers insisted he died repentant, turning his last words into prayers, asking forgiveness for what he had done. Others saw only a monster who received far less suffering than he had given. And so, Gilles de Rais stands as one of the strangest figures in medieval history. A knight who fought beside a saint, who once embodied chivalry and honor, but who ended as one of the most reviled killers Europe had ever known. His story lingers, not only in dusty trial records, but in folklore and fairy tales, proof that sometimes the darkest shadows are cast by those who once stood in the brightest light. Now we turn to Germany, to the Rhineland in the late 16th century. The year is 1589, and the villagers of Bedburg whisper a name that curdles the blood: Peter Stumpp. By day he seemed an ordinary farmer, a widower, a man raising children, tilling his land, going about the humble business of rural life. But by night, the stories said, he became something else entirely. Livestock began to vanish, their carcasses found torn open, mangled in ways too savage to be blamed on common wolves. Then came the human victims: travelers dragged from roadsides, women attacked in fields, children gone missing without a trace. Bedburg lived in fear. People spoke not of a man, but of a monster, a beast prowling the countryside. And soon that monster had a name. Peter Stumpp was arrested after years of terror, and what followed is one of the strangest confessions in European history. Under the torture of the rack, he admitted not merely to murder, but to witchcraft. He claimed that as a young man, he had made a pact with the devil himself, who gave him a magical belt or girdle. When he fastened it around his waist, he said he transformed into a wolf, stronger, faster, hungrier than any beast in the forest. In this shape he claimed he had killed men, women and children, feasting on their flesh with insatiable appetite. The stories that poured out of him under interrogation were almost beyond belief. He spoke of eating the hearts of children, of murdering his own son, of committing atrocities too grim for most chroniclers to record in detail. He was accused of incest, of sorcery, of consorting with demons. And while we must remember these confessions were dragged out under torture, the scale of the accusations left a stain that history has never washed away. The trial documents describe him as the very image of evil. The people of Bedburg did not see Peter Stumpp as a mere criminal. They saw him as a werewolf, a predator wearing human skin. In their eyes, only the devil's hand could explain such acts. His crimes were placed not just in the realm of murder, but in the realm of the supernatural. When the sentence came, it was as brutal as the crimes themselves. Stumpp was condemned to die in a manner designed not just to punish, but to terrify. On October 31st, 1589, he was placed upon a breaking wheel. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers. His limbs were smashed with the blunt side of an axe, one by one, so he could never rise again. Finally, he was beheaded and his body burned. His mistress and daughter, accused of sharing in his crimes, were also executed. As a warning to others, the villagers erected a pole bearing the image of a wolf, and atop it, the severed head of Peter Stumpp. Was he truly guilty of all that was claimed? That is harder to say. Some historians argue that the charges were exaggerated, even fabricated, in a time when witch hunts swept through Europe and torture extracted whatever stories interrogators demanded. Others believe that behind the werewolf legend was indeed a serial killer, a man whose bloodlust took the form of crimes against both animals and people. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. But what mattered most to the people of Bedburg was not the exact number of his victims, nor whether the devil had truly given him a belt of fur. What mattered was that their fear had a face. Their suffering, their terror, was given form in the figure of the Werewolf of Bedburg. Even now his name survives, woven into the folklore of werewolves and shapeshifters, cited as proof that behind the myth of the beast may lurk the horror of human cruelty. Peter Stumpp is remembered not as a farmer, not as a father, but as the man who blurred the line between man and monster. And so his story lingers. In the flicker of a fire, in the howl of a wolf across a dark field, one can still imagine the footsteps of Peter Stumpp, footsteps that carried a man into legend and left only fear behind. From the forests of Germany, our path turns east into the hills of Hungary at the turn of the 17th century. Here lived a noblewoman whose name has become legend, tangled in fact and folklore, until it is hard to see where one ends and the other begins. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, and history remembers her as the most prolific female murderer of all time. Born in 1560 to one of the most powerful families in Hungary, Elizabeth grew up in castles, surrounded by privilege and political influence. Her family held vast estates, commanded armies, and even claimed kinship with kings. From childhood, she was taught not only languages and etiquette, but also the stern discipline of aristocracy. At 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nádasdy, a soldier known as the Black Knight of Hungary, and together they ruled over sprawling lands from their fortress at Kyteler. But the stories that clung to Elizabeth were not of governance or diplomacy. They were of cruelty. Servants whispered that she was quick to anger, that punishments in her household went far beyond the ordinary harshness of the age. A maid who disobeyed might be struck, cut, or burned. Small transgressions earned wounds that left scars. These whispers grew louder after the death of her husband in 1604, when Elizabeth, still wealthy and powerful, managed her estates alone. Soon young girls began to disappear. Peasant families who sent their daughters to serve at the castle noticed that some never returned. Villagers murmured of blood on the snow, of bodies buried hastily in fields, of screams drifting down from the high stone walls at night. The tales multiplied, girls tortured with needles, beaten to death, frozen in the winter air. And then came the most famous claim of all, that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth and beauty. According to this story, after a servant's blood splattered on her skin during a beating, she believed she looked younger, fresher. From that moment on, she supposedly sought out more victims, convinced that their blood was the secret to eternal youth. How much of this is true, and how much is legend, remains a mystery. What is certain is that in 1610, the rumors grew too loud to ignore. King Matthias of Hungary ordered an investigation. Witnesses came forward, dozens of them, servants, neighbors, even nobles. Their testimonies painted a picture of unimaginable brutality. Some claimed Elizabeth was responsible for the deaths of more than 600 girls. Others gave smaller numbers, but still in the hundreds. Elizabeth herself was never put on trial in the usual sense. To prosecute a noblewoman of her rank would have been politically dangerous. Instead, she was placed under house arrest in her castle. Her accomplices, maids, and servants accused of helping her were tortured and executed, their bodies destroyed as an example. Elizabeth, however, was walled up in a chamber of her fortress, with only small openings left for food and air. There she lived out the last 4 years of her life, dying in 1614, alone in darkness. What makes her story so enduring is the way it straddles history and myth. On one hand, the testimonies against her were gathered under torture, and the politics of the time gave her enemies plenty of reason to destroy her. A rich, powerful widow, holding vast lands, was a dangerous figure in a kingdom hungry for stability. It is possible, some argue, that Elizabeth was framed, her reputation blackened to seize her fortune. On the other hand, the consistency of the accounts, the missing girls, the found bodies, the stories that matched across witnesses, suggests that something horrific did happen in those halls. Perhaps not the bathing in blood, perhaps not 600 victims, but enough death that her name became synonymous with cruelty. Over the centuries, Elizabeth Báthory's legend, writers turned her into the Blood Countess, a woman who sought immortality through murder. Her name became entwined with vampire lore, standing beside Dracula as a figure of eternal hunger. Whether she was guilty of every accusation or not, her story became larger than life, a cautionary tale of power, vanity, and horror. And so her shadow remains. In Hungary, her castles still stand, their stones heavy with silence. Tourists walk their halls and shiver at the thought of what may have happened there. Was Elizabeth Báthory a victim of political conspiracy, or one of the most ruthless killers in history? The truth lies buried with her, behind the walls that sealed her fate. Not all shadows of history linger in Europe. To find one of the most chilling figures of organized killing, we must travel east, to India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Here lived a man named Behram, remembered today as one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. He was not a solitary predator hiding in castles or forests. Instead, he was part of something larger, a network of death known as the Thuggee cult. The word thug comes from the Hindi thag, meaning swindler or deceiver. The Thuggees were groups of highway killers who traveled across India, blending into the landscape as merchants, pilgrims, or travelers. They offered companionship to those they met on the road, fellowship, shared meals, the safety of numbers. And then, when the moment came, they turned on their companions. Behram, who lived during the late Mughal and early British colonial era, was said to be one of their leaders. His chosen weapon was a piece of cloth, a rumal, a simple handkerchief with a small coin or knot tied into one end. With it he strangled his victims, slipping the cloth around their necks in a practiced motion. Quick, silent, efficient. According to later reports, he could kill with a single tug, the weighted cloth crushing the windpipe before a cry could escape. British records, drawn from interrogations and trials after the Thuggees were suppressed, attribute over 900 murders to Behram alone. 900 lives ended not in noisy battlefields, but quietly on dusty roads under starlit skies. Some accounts raise the number even higher. Unlike other killers we've met, Behram did not act from solitary compulsion. The Thuggees framed their killings as religious duty, sacrifices to the goddess Kali. Murder was ritual, performed with prayers, with rules about who could and could not be killed. Children, for example, were sometimes spared, but travelers with wealth or strength were marked for death. Victims were buried in shallow graves by the roadside, their possessions taken to fund the Brotherhood's journeys. It is difficult, centuries later, to know how much of Behram's story is truth and how much was magnified by colonial chroniclers, eager to portray India as a land of dark superstition. Some historians argue that the numbers were inflated, that Behram himself may have been more myth than man. Yet the fear was real enough that the British launched massive campaigns to hunt the Thuggees down, treating them as an invisible army of killers hiding in plain sight. Behram was eventually captured in the 1830s, when the British intensified their crackdowns. Accounts say he confessed to hundreds of murders, though how freely those confessions were given is impossible to know. Some suggest he even turned informer against his own companions, describing their methods in exchange for leniency. His ultimate fate is disputed. Some records claim he was executed, others that he died in prison. But what makes Behram's story chilling is not just the numbers, it is the method. The image of a man smiling by your campfire, sharing food, walking beside you on the road, only to slip a cloth around your neck when you least expect it. The betrayal of trust made physical, the weapon nothing more than a handkerchief. Today his name is a shadow in history, but the legacy of the Thuggees lives on. The word thug spread far beyond India, carried into English and countless other languages, detached from its origins, but still carrying a whisper of menace. And in the story of Behram, we see a different kind of killer, not a solitary madman, but one who killed as part of a ritualized machine, where death was not just compulsion, but creed. And so the candle burns lower. In one corner of the world, villagers feared a nobleman with castles. In another, they feared a farmer who wore a wolf's skin. In Hungary, a countess behind stone walls. And here on the long roads of India, a man with nothing more than a piece of cloth, who may have ended more lives than any of them. In the wooded hills of 16th century Germany, travelers whispered about disappearances along lonely roads. Merchants, pilgrims, even soldiers seemed to vanish into thin air, their possessions never reclaimed, their bodies never found. And at the heart of these tales was a name, Christman Genipperteinga, remembered as one of the most feared outlaws of his time. Unlike noble-born killers or shadowy cult leaders, Christman lived as a bandit. He carved his existence out of the lawless stretches of the Holy Roman Empire, where local lords had only limited reach, and a man with cunning could build his own dominion. His kingdom was not of stone or banners, but of terror, hidden in a cave system where he and his band of followers held sway. According to the accounts that survive, Christman ruled over a gang that kidnapped travelers, stripping them of wealth before ending their lives. The cave became not just a hideout, but a slaughterhouse. When the authorities finally raided it, they found grisly evidence of his crimes: bones, weapons, clothing, and the remnants of those who had disappeared over the years. What makes Christman's tale stand out is the sheer scale. Chroniclers claimed that his band had murdered nearly 1,000 people over a span of 13 years. 964 victims, so the figure goes. The number is staggering, almost too large to believe, and some historians suspect it was exaggerated by frightened locals or zealous magistrates. But even if the truth was smaller, the legend grew so large that Christman entered the grim pantheon of medieval monsters. The cave itself became symbolic, a dark underworld where daylight never reached, where the bones of innocents lay in heaps. To villagers, it must have felt like something out of scripture, a pit ruled by a demon in human skin, a place where ordinary travelers could vanish into hell itself. Christman was not just a bandit, he was a nightmare with a name. When at last he was captured, the trial was swift. He confessed, or was made to confess, to years of killing and theft. The punishment, fitting for the era, was as spectacular as his crimes. He was executed by breaking wheel, one of the most excruciating methods available. His limbs shattered one by one with an iron club. His body bound to the wheel, left exposed as a warning to all who passed. For days, perhaps longer, his broken form remained on display until death finally claimed him. The people of Germany remembered him not merely as a criminal, but as a plague upon the land. His story traveled far, retold in taverns and villages, magnified by each telling. Some described him as almost supernatural, a devil walking in human form. Others used his tale as a moral lesson, proof of what greed and cruelty could do when unchecked by faith or law. Today, Christman Genipperteinga survives mostly in fragments, half history and half folklore. Was he truly the murderer of nearly 1,000 souls, or was that figure an invention, a way of turning an outlaw into a monster that children would fear? The records are too scarce to know for certain, but the image of his cave, dark, cold, filled with the remains of the lost, remains one of the most haunting in medieval lore. What makes his story so striking, when placed beside the noble Gilles de Rais or the aristocratic Elizabeth Báthory, is that Christman was no lord or lady. He was not shielded by rank or wealth. He was an outlaw in the truest sense, a man who made himself infamous not with castles or titles, but with brutality and fear. His cave of bones was his legacy, and through it, his name lingers centuries later. And so, as we move deeper into this candlelit journey, we see the faces of medieval killers shift. A knight who rode with saints, a farmer who claimed to be a werewolf, a countess behind castle walls, and here a bandit king of shadows, ruling a kingdom of corpses in a cave where the living dared not tread. In the early 14th century, in the medieval city of Kilkenny, Ireland, there lived a woman of wealth and power whose name became wrapped in scandal, Alice Kyteler. Unlike the wandering bandits or battlefield knights who turned to murder, Alice's story sits at the crossroads of crime, witchcraft, and power. She was accused not just of sorcery, but of using dark rituals to kill her husbands one by one. Alice was born into a family of Flemish merchants and grew wealthy through trade. Over her lifetime, she married 4 times, each husband richer than the last. With each death, her fortune grew, until whispers began to follow her through the market streets. It was said that her husbands did not simply die of sickness or age. They were poisoned, their health wasted away by a hand too skilled to be chance. By the time her 4th husband, Sir John Lepore, fell ill, suspicion had hardened into accusation. He claimed before his death that Alice had tricked him, that she had laced his food and drink with powders to bring about his end. Servants whispered of strange rituals in the dead of night, of black candles burning, of sacrifices made in secret. The charge was not just of murder, it was of witchcraft, a crime that in medieval Ireland carried both terror and fascination. The Bishop of Ossory, Richard de Ledred, seized upon these suspicions with zeal. He accused Alice and her household of heresy, sorcery, and murder. According to the records, he claimed she had sacrificed animals to demons, mixed poisons from the organs of toads and cats, and consorted with a dark familiar spirit. Some testimonies went further, describing night rituals in which she supposedly denied the church and offered her soul to the devil. But beneath the layers of witchcraft accusation lies the outline of something simpler and more chilling. If the charges were true, Alice may well have been a serial poisoner, a woman who used her knowledge of herbs and powders to dispatch her husbands for wealth and freedom. In an age where medicine was poorly understood, poison was one of the few reliable tools for a murderer, and Alice may have mastered it. Her trial in 1324 became infamous as one of the earliest witchcraft prosecutions in Europe. While Alice herself managed to escape, fleeing Ireland and vanishing into history, her servants and associates paid the price. Petronilla de Meath, her maid, was tortured until she confessed to helping Alice with sorcery and murders. She was burned at the stake, the first woman in Ireland known to have suffered that fate for witchcraft. Alice left behind unanswered questions. Did she truly poison her husbands? Or was she a wealthy widow targeted by a bishop, eager to make an example? Was she a cunning murderer, or a victim of the medieval obsession with witches and heretics? The truth remains lost. What survives is the legend, a noble woman whose name still clings to Kilkenny, the Witch of Ireland, who walked free while others burned in her place. What makes her story chilling among the others we've heard is the intimacy of her alleged crimes. Not a stranger in the woods, not a bandit on the roads, but a wife at the table, pouring drink into her husband's cup. Murder not through brute force, but through the slow, invisible work of poison. A kiss goodnight, a whispered word, and a powder stirred into wine. Death arriving silently in the home, night after night, husband after husband. And so Lady Alice Kyteler stands as one of medieval history's most enigmatic figures. Perhaps a murderer, perhaps a scapegoat, but either way a reminder that the face of death was not always the stranger in the forest. Sometimes it was the one sitting across from you at supper, smiling as the candlelight flickered between you. In the late 16th century, not far from the French town of Dole, in Franche-Comté, villagers lived in fear of the woods. Children were vanishing. Their bodies, when found, bore marks too brutal to explain away as ordinary wolf attacks. The culprit, they believed, was no ordinary predator, but a man-turned-beast. A hermit named Gilles Garnier, remembered to this day as the Werewolf of Dole. Gilles lived on the margins of society, a recluse with his wife in a lonely cabin near the forest. Poor, isolated, and awkward among neighbors, he struggled to provide. Food was scarce, money scarcer still. In this hunger, the line between survival and savagery blurred. The disappearances began in 1572. A girl was found dead, her body mutilated. Soon after, a boy vanished, then another girl. Panic spread quickly. Wolves roamed the forests, but the violence of these killings felt different, deliberate. The victims had been not only torn apart, but partially eaten, and rumors began to stir. The killer walked not on 4 legs, but 2. One evening, townsfolk claimed they saw a strange, gaunt figure crouched over a child's corpse in the woods. To some it looked like a wolf, to others it was unmistakably a man. Whispers spread that Gilles Garnier had been given a wolf's pelt by the devil himself, a charm that allowed him to change shape and feed on flesh. The suspicion grew so strong that the authorities moved quickly. Gilles was arrested, dragged from his hut, and accused of being both murderer and werewolf. Under interrogation, Gilles confessed. He admitted to killing at least 4 children, sometimes strangling them, sometimes stabbing them, always taking their flesh back to his wife so the two could eat. He spoke of hunger, of desperation, of being unable to care for his family by any other means. But he also admitted to something darker, a pact with the devil, who gave him an ointment that let him transform into a wolf. In this form, he said, he hunted more easily, striking down his victims as a beast. Whether Gilles truly believed this, or whether the confession was shaped by torture and superstition, is hard to know. In the late 1500s, France was gripped by werewolf trials. Dozens of men and women accused of shape-shifting and cannibalism, their stories blurring myth and crime. Gilles' case was one of the most notorious, his crimes mingling with the fears of a community already steeped in tales of the supernatural. The court found him guilty in 1573. The sentence was death by burning, the punishment for both witchcraft and murder. On the day of his execution, he was bound to the stake before a crowd of villagers who watched the fire consume him. For them, it was justice not just against a killer, but against a monster who had walked among them disguised as human. Today, historians read the story differently. Gilles Garnier was no werewolf. He was a man, isolated and desperate, who preyed on children when hunger and madness overtook him. The wolf's pelt, the devil's pact, the ointment. These were the ways people of the time explained acts too terrible to face in human terms. In a world without the concept of serial killers, the werewolf was the closest shape they had for such horror. And so Gilles Garnier's name remains in folklore, not just as a murderer, but as a creature of nightmare. His story reminds us how medieval people blurred the line between myth and reality, between beast and man, when faced with crimes that shattered the ordinary rhythm of life. Imagine the forest at dusk, the shadows lengthening, the rustle of leaves behind you. In that silence, a figure moves. Is it a wolf or a man? In the world of Gilles Garnier, it was both. In the chronicles of early modern Germany, few names spread such terror as Peter Niers, an outlaw whose crimes were said to be steeped not only in blood but in sorcery. His story belongs to the late 1500s, a time when superstition and brutality walked hand in hand. To villagers across the Holy Roman Empire, he was not merely a bandit, he was a dark magician, a servant of the devil, a man who carried death wherever he went. Niers began his career as part of a wandering band of thieves. He moved from town to town, robbing travelers, raiding villages, disappearing into the forests when pursuit grew too close. But while robbery was common enough in those unsettled years, Niers' reputation grew far darker than that of an ordinary highwayman. Whispers claimed that he murdered relentlessly, not just for profit but for pleasure, and for rituals. According to confessions attributed to him, Niers admitted to over 500 murders. Many of his victims were pregnant women. He was said to cut the unborn children from their bodies, using the fetuses in gruesome magical rites. Some chroniclers claimed he rendered their fat into candles or consumed their hearts to increase his powers. To his pursuers, this was proof that he was no ordinary criminal, but a sorcerer bound by pact to infernal forces. The most enduring part of his legend was his supposed ability to change shape. Niers was believed to carry small magical charms, perhaps made from the remains of his victims, which allowed him to transform into animals, a goat, a dog, even a fly. When villagers thought they had him cornered, he slipped away, his form altered, his escape unexplainable. Each disappearance added fuel to the belief that he was more demon than man. For decades he eluded capture, the forests of Germany sheltering his band of followers. But in 1577, authorities finally laid hands on him. He was tried, condemned, and remarkably, managed to escape before the sentence was carried out. The failure to hold him only magnified his reputation. To the people, it was further proof of his supernatural protections. His freedom, however, was not eternal. In 1581, near the city of Neumarkt, Peter Niers was recognized while lodging at an inn. This time there was no escape. He was seized, shackled, and subjected to one of the most horrific executions recorded in German history. The method was the breaking wheel, carried out over 3 days. On the first day, his flesh was torn with red-hot pincers. On the second, his limbs were smashed, one after another, with iron bars. On the third, he was finally broken entirely upon the wheel, his body left to die slowly in the open air, his remains displayed as a warning. Witnesses claimed he endured unspeakable agony, fitting punishment, they believed, for a man accused of sorcery and hundreds of murders. Today, it is difficult to separate fact from legend in Niers's story. The figure of 500 murders is almost certainly exaggerated, a reflection of how fear magnified every tale told about him. His supposed use of black magic, the fetuses, the shape-shifting, the charms, likely came from confessions forced under torture and from the fertile imagination of terrified villagers. Yet behind the exaggerations was a real man, a career criminal whose violence left a mark strong enough to fuel one of the most monstrous reputations of the age. What sets Peter Niers apart from others is how thoroughly his crimes blurred with myth. He was remembered not simply as a killer, but as a magician, a shapeshifter, a servant of Satan. In the minds of his contemporaries, no ordinary man could commit such horrors, and so he became something other, a figure straddling the line between history and folklore. Even now, his story chills. Imagine a traveler walking alone on a forest road, hearing footsteps behind them, turning to see a stranger's face in the shadows. Is it merely a thief? Or is it Peter Niers, the sorcerer with a knife in one hand and a charm in the other, ready to vanish into thin air once the deed is done? That was the terror of his age. That was the legacy of Peter Niers. Among the chronicles of German principalities in the late Middle Ages, one story lingers in shadow, that of Christina of Bruswick, a noblewoman whose name became tied to whispered accounts of poison, betrayal, and death. Her case is far less famous than Gilles de Rais or Peter Niers, but in its quiet, sinister way, it reveals another face of medieval killing, the calculated art of poisoning. Christina was a lady of standing, moving among the courts of Brunswick, where alliances were fragile and power could shift overnight. Unlike the bandits who lurked in forests or the hermits who stalked children in fields, Christina's world was polished halls and candlelit feasts. Yet it was here, at the long banquet tables of the nobility, that she was said to weave her murders. Poison was the weapon of choice, for those who could not wield a sword, or for those who preferred subtlety over bloodshed. In a time before chemical analysis, a cup of wine laced with powders could silence an enemy without a trace. Illness came on gradually, the victim weakening day by day, the cause attributed to fever or divine punishment. Only the pattern, one death after another, clustered around the same figure, betrayed the truth. That was the pattern that surrounded Christina. Servants whispered of her preparing strange mixtures, of herbs and minerals ground together, of goblets handed to rivals or even family members who stood inconveniently in her way. Some said she killed for power, ensuring her influence remained unchallenged. Others whispered it was greed, inheritances, dowries, lands shifting with each death. The accusations came to light after a string of suspicious deaths in the Brunswick court. Husbands, cousins, even retainers close to Christina succumbed to mysterious sicknesses. The speed with which her household grew wealthy and her rivals dwindled made tongues wag. When one too many nobles collapsed after feasts in her halls, suspicion hardened into formal charge. Her trial, such as it was, unfolded with the drama of the age. Christina was accused not only of murder, but of sorcery, for poison was often linked with witchcraft. To brew powders and tinctures that killed was in the minds of her judges no different from summoning demons. Witnesses spoke of powders hidden in rings, of liquids poured in secret, of deaths that piled like stones at her feet. The evidence was thin, as it often was in such cases, but the fear was overwhelming. Few doubted that something sinister had been at work. Poison, after all, was the most terrifying weapon in a world where trust was already fragile. A knife in the dark, you might avoid, but who could refuse a cup of wine at a feast without offending one's host? Christina's fate was sealed. Condemned as both poisoner and witch, she was sentenced to die. Records suggest she was executed by fire, the punishment reserved for those who combined heresy with murder. Her death was staged as a warning, a public theatre of justice, meant to assure the people that the hidden threat had been extinguished. What makes Christina of Brunswick so haunting, though, is how little of her story can be separated from rumour. Was she truly guilty of orchestrating a string of poisonings, or was she a noble woman destroyed by political enemies, who found it convenient to brand her a witch? In a world where women of power were often met with suspicion, it is impossible to know. Yet, whether she was guilty of 10 murders or none, her name became bound forever to the idea of the poisoned chalice. Her story, like that of Lady Alice Kyteler in Ireland, shows how the medieval imagination linked poison, witchcraft, and female cunning. To her contemporaries, a woman with knowledge of herbs and the ambition to use them was not merely dangerous, she was monstrous. So Christina of Bruswick lives on, not as a bandit in the woods or a soldier turned killer, but as a reminder that some of the deadliest medieval murderers may have worn silk gowns, sat at banquet tables, and smiled across the rim of a gilded goblet. The bustling city of Nuremberg in the 1500s was a hub of trade and craftsmanship, its guild halls crowded with merchants, its markets spilling with goods from across Europe. But beneath the hum of commerce and the ringing of church bells, fear crept through the narrow alleys. People whispered about disappearances that could not be blamed on war, plague, or famine. The name that surfaced again and again was Erasmus, a man who lived not as a noble, nor as a bandit on the road, but as a killer hidden within the city itself. Unlike the rural predators who stalked lonely forests, Erasmus hunted where people felt most secure. He prowled the taverns, the marketplaces, the streets at dusk, when shutters closed and lanterns flickered weakly against the dark. Victims vanished, not into wild woods, but into the heart of a thriving city, and the shock was all the greater for it. The records that survive paint him as a man without remorse, methodical and relentless. He confessed, after his capture, to more than 90 murders, carried out over years. Many of his victims were travelers, merchants passing through, strangers who would not be missed quickly. Others were locals, lured or ambushed when opportunity arose. Some accounts claim he killed for money, others that he killed simply for the pleasure of it. Whatever his motive, the pattern was unmistakable. He struck again and again, leaving bodies that spoke of deliberate cruelty. What horrified the people of Nuremberg most was not just the number of deaths, but the ordinariness of his disguise. Erasmus blended in, his face unremarkable, his manner quiet. He was no wild-eyed demon or howling werewolf of legend. He was a man one might brush shoulders with in a market, share a bench with in a tavern, and never suspect until it was too late. When he was finally caught, the city erupted with both relief and rage. The trial became a public spectacle. Erasmus, under questioning, admitted freely to his crimes, even boasting of them. Chroniclers noted how calmly he described the killings, as though recounting a routine. It was this calmness, this chilling detachment, that branded him not as an outlaw driven by desperation, but as something far more terrifying, a man who killed because he wanted to. The execution that followed was designed not just to punish, but to make a statement. Erasmus was condemned to the breaking wheel, one of the harshest fates of the time. His limbs were shattered with iron, his body stretched and displayed. For hours, perhaps days, he lingered in agony, a living warning to all who might follow his path. Crowds gathered to watch, to see the monster unmasked, to assure themselves that the terror haunting their streets was finally ended. And yet, Erasmus's story lived on. His name entered the chronicles of Nuremberg as a symbol of the evil that could hide in plain sight. In a world where killers were often imagined as creatures of the night, wolves in human form, Erasmus proved that the true predator could wear the face of a neighbor. What makes his story so disturbing, even now, is the familiarity of it. Gilles de Rais was a nobleman behind castle walls. Peter Stumpp claimed to be a werewolf. Gilles Garnier stalked children as a hermit. But Erasmus, he was an urban killer, preying among crowds, walking unnoticed through streets, filled with laughter and commerce. He showed that the city, with all its light and bustle, could still hide a darkness as deep as any forest. And so his memory lingers. Erasmus of Nuremberg, the man who turned alleyways into hunting grounds, who confessed to dozens of murders without a flicker of remorse, stands as one of the clearest medieval echoes of what we now call a serial killer. His story is a reminder that evil needs no castle, no curse, no legend. Sometimes it needs only a man with a knife and the will to use it, again and again. Not all werewolves in medieval records were cast as killers lurking in the shadows. In one curious case from 17th century Livonia, a land stretching across what is now Latvia and Estonia, a man named Thies of Kaltenbrunn stood in court and declared that he was indeed a werewolf. But unlike Gilles Garnier or Peter Stumpp, he claimed he was no servant of the devil. Instead, he said he was one of the faithful, a hound of God who fought against witches and sorcerers on behalf of heaven itself. Thies was an old man when he was put on trial in 1692. Villagers had accused him of strange practices, of consorting with magic, of wandering at night in wolf's form. When the judges pressed him, expecting denial or fear, he astonished them by embracing the charge. Yes, he said, he was a werewolf, but his transformations were not wicked. On certain nights of the year, he and other werewolves would travel in spirit to battle witches and demons in the underworld. They fought to protect the harvests and the souls of the living. Without their struggles, he insisted, the crops would wither and famine would follow. The court was baffled. Werewolves were supposed to be monsters, servants of Satan. But here stood Thies, explaining calmly that he and his fellow werewolves served God. They were warriors, not predators. He even described their weapons, iron rods and staves, with which they beat back the devil's servants. Far from devouring children, he claimed to be saving the community from ruin. This inversion of the usual werewolf tale unsettled the judges. To them, anything linked with shapeshifting and nocturnal journeys must be heresy. They tried to force Thies to admit that he had made a pact with the devil, that his power came from infernal sources. But Thies refused. No, he insisted, the werewolves were God's hounds, chosen to defend the people from greater evils. For the court, this defense was no defense at all. If he was not a witch, then at the very least he was a blasphemer. Thies was condemned not to death, but to flogging and exile. His testimony, however, outlived the punishment. Unlike the bloody confessions of other so-called werewolves, Thies's words became a rare glimpse into the way folklore could twist in unexpected directions. How, in one corner of Europe, the werewolf was imagined not as a killer, but as a protector. And yet his story still belongs among the darker threads of medieval crime and punishment. For even if Thies claimed to be a defender of crops and souls, his neighbors feared him. His very existence unsettled the fragile balance of village life. He was an old man who walked differently from others, who spoke with certainty about unseen worlds. In a society gripped by suspicion, that alone was enough to mark him as dangerous. We do not know whether Thies ever harmed anyone, in truth. His tale contains no long list of victims, no corpses found in forests. Instead, what we see is how deeply the idea of the killer werewolf had sunk into the imagination of Europe. Villagers expected monsters, judges expected confessions of blood and cannibalism. And Thies gave them something else, a werewolf who fought on the side of the light. Perhaps this was his way of surviving, spinning a narrative that spared him the pyre. Or perhaps he genuinely believed it, carrying into old age a vision of himself as chosen, transformed not by evil, but by divine necessity. Either way, his story unsettled the courts and puzzled the chroniclers. What lingers is the strangeness of it. In the candlelit chambers of a 17th century courtroom, a man declared under oath that he was a werewolf, and not a monster, but a guardian. To his neighbors he remained a danger. To the judges he was a heretic. But to us, looking back, He stands as one of the most unusual figures in the long, grim gallery of Europe's supposed killers. A werewolf who claimed his claws were meant to protect, not to destroy. The year was 1861, and the fields and villages around Lyon, France, were restless with rumor. Young women, mostly servant girls seeking work, were disappearing after traveling with a man who promised them employment. They set out hopeful, with bundles of clothing and letters of recommendation in hand, but they never arrived at the households where jobs supposedly awaited them. Instead, they vanished into the countryside. The man responsible was Martin Dumollard, a name that would soon become infamous across France. Though his crimes belong to the 19th century, Dumollard's methods echo the oldest instincts of predation, deception, trust gained, and betrayal in the most vulnerable moment. He presented himself as helpful, a middleman who could guide rural women into positions in the city, where demand for maids and laundresses was high. In reality, he led them into forests and lonely paths, where promises of work turned into ambush. When authorities finally pieced together his pattern, the scale was horrifying. Witnesses spoke of women last seen walking beside him, carrying their small possessions, only for their belongings to later surface in his home. Police raids uncovered piles of clothing and personal effects, the silent testimony of countless victims. The total number remains uncertain, but Dumollard was believed to have murdered at least a dozen women, possibly far more. What made his crimes particularly chilling was the calculated nature of his lures. These were not random attacks, but rehearsed lies, perfected over years. He targeted the desperate, young women alone, far from their families, clinging to the fragile hope of work. For them, his offer seemed like kindness. For him, it was bait. When he was finally brought to trial in 1862, Dumollard's demeanor shocked the public almost as much as his crimes. He was not eloquent, not grand, not even especially cunning in appearance. He seemed dull, plodding, almost stupid. Yet behind that ordinariness was a predator who had outwitted police for years. His wife, too, was accused of complicity, charged with helping dispose of the victims' clothing and benefiting from their stolen goods. The courtroom was packed. Newspapers carried every sordid detail, turning Dumollard into a national fascination. The evidence was overwhelming, the belongings of vanished women stacked in his home, the testimonies of those who had narrowly escaped his traps, the corpses exhumed where he had left them. The sentence was death. In March of 1862, Martin Dumollard was guillotined in front of a large crowd, his life ending as abruptly as the many he had stolen. His wife, though found guilty of aiding him, was spared execution and sentenced to hard labor instead. What sets Dumollard apart from earlier figures in this grim gallery is the way his crimes bridge medieval and modern. His world had trains, newspapers, and courts of law, but the essence of his killings was as old as time, a stranger offering trust, leading the vulnerable into the shadows. His methods recall the legends of highwaymen and child stealers of centuries past. Yet his trial and execution unfolded under the glare of modern journalism, ensuring his name became infamous beyond his region. And so his story lingers as a warning, not of wolves in the forest or witches in castles, but of ordinary men with ordinary faces, who turn desperation into opportunity, who use trust as their sharpest weapon. For the young women of 19th century France, Martin Dumollard was not just a criminal, he was the embodiment of every whispered fear, the man who smiles, promises work, and leads you into silence. Legends often grow where records are thin, and one of the darkest tales to haunt Scotland is that of Sonny Bean, a man said to have led a clan of killers who stalked the roads, butchered travellers, and feasted on their flesh. Whether every detail is true or not, the story of Sonny Bean has endured for centuries, passed down as both a warning and a nightmare. The tale places Sonny's life sometime in the late Middle Ages or early modern period. He was born to poor parents in East Lothian, but rejected honest labour. Instead, he drifted toward a life of crime, pairing with a woman as ruthless as himself. Together they sought refuge in a cave on the rugged Ayrshire coast, a cavern that stretched deep into the cliffs, hidden by tides, and nearly impossible to find unless you knew its secret. There, Sonny and his wife built a family. Over the years, their children, and later their grandchildren, grew up entirely within the cave's shadows, never mingling with the outside world. Cut off from society, they formed a clan bound by blood and violence, multiplying until their numbers reached dozens. To feed themselves, they turned to ambush. By day they remained hidden. By night they crept onto lonely roads, waylaying travelers, merchants and pilgrims. Their victims were dragged back to the cavern, where they were butchered like livestock. Flesh was salted and preserved for lean times. Bones were cast aside, or crafted into grisly tools. In this way, the Bean clan sustained itself for decades, their cave becoming a hidden slaughterhouse. Stories spread of disappearances along the coastal routes. Horses were found riderless, carts abandoned, bloodstains darkening the earth. At times, mangled body parts washed ashore, carried out by the tides from the hidden cavern. Yet no one could find the lair, and suspicion fell on innocent innkeepers or wandering strangers. Meanwhile, the Beans feasted, their clan growing ever larger. The legend claims they killed and consumed over 1,000 victims during their reign of terror. For nearly 25 years, they evaded discovery, the cave swallowing every trace of their crimes. It was only when one victim escaped, a man traveling with his wife, who was attacked and killed before his eyes, that the alarm was raised in earnest. The survivor carried the tale to authorities, and King James VI himself was said to have ordered a search. What followed was a manhunt unlike any Scotland had seen. Soldiers, dogs, and trackers scoured the coast until the entrance to the cavern was uncovered. Inside, the scene was ghastly, salted body parts hanging from hooks, piles of bones, heaps of clothing and jewelry, stripped from the dead. The myth insists that the sight sickened even hardened soldiers, who had never before encountered such deliberate cruelty. The Bean clan was captured and taken in chains to Edinburgh. There was no trial, for their guilt was considered beyond question. The punishment was swift and merciless. Men were executed by having their limbs cut away and left to bleed, while the women and children were burned alive. Not one was spared. In the eyes of their captors, they were not human beings, but beasts who had forfeited their claim to mercy. Historians debate whether Sawney Bean truly existed. Some suggest his story was exaggerated, or even invented as a piece of folklore, a tale to frighten children, or to vilify the rural poor. Others argue that the kernel of truth may lie in real bandit families who lived by robbery and murder, their crimes expanded by centuries of retelling. True or not, the legend endures. The cave in Ayrshire is still pointed out as Sawney Bean's cave, and visitors speak of a chill in the air when they step into its darkness. The story has seeped into popular culture, inspiring plays, ballads, and even horror films. What makes Sawney Bean's tale so enduring is not just the horror of cannibalism, but the idea of a family, an entire community, built on murder. Not a lone killer, not even a small gang, but a clan whose children were raised to see killing as normal, flesh as food, cruelty as survival. In that sense, the story of Sawney Bean may be legend, but it touches a fear far older than history, that evil is not always an outsider, but can be inherited, multiplied, and passed down through generations in the shadows of a cave. Power in medieval Europe was rarely gentle, and for women on the throne, it was often perilous. Few rulers embody this better than Joanna Red, of Naples, whose reign in the 14th century was overshadowed by scandal, intrigue, and whispered accusations of murder. Though she was a sovereign queen, her name became stained with the charge of killing the men closest to her. Joanna inherited the throne, young at barely 16, after the death of her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, in 1343. Her position was precarious from the start. Surrounded by ambitious nobles and foreign claimants, she was expected to secure her rule through marriage. She wed Andrew of Hungary, a prince who came south to Naples with royal blood in his veins, but little respect from her court. Andrew was unpopular among Neapolitan nobles, seen as an outsider and a threat to their influence. In 1345, Andrew was found strangled to death while hunting in Aversa. His killers were never formally identified, but suspicion fell quickly upon Joanna. To her enemies, the case was simple. She wanted to rid herself of an unloved husband and maintain her power. To her supporters, it was more complicated, a conspiracy of nobles who feared Andrew's claim to rule in his own right. Either way, the shadow of his death followed Joanna for the rest of her life. The scandal grew when she remarried, this time to Louis of Taranto. For a moment her reign steadied, but once again her husband died suddenly. In 1362, the whispers returned: poison, strangulation, betrayal in the bedchamber. 2 dead husbands in less than 20 years was too much for gossip to ignore. Joanna married twice more, James IV of Major, then Otto of Brunswick, both alliances born of necessity, each husband chosen to keep her fragile throne from slipping away. Each marriage ended in tragedy, with her husbands either deposed, imprisoned, or killed. And each time tongues wagged, was Joanna cursed? Or was she the curse? Her enemies seized the rumors eagerly. When the papacy split in 1378 during the Great Schism, Joanna supported the Avignon Pope, angering Rome. Her rival Charles of Durazzo used the old accusations of murder to brand her, not only as a traitor to the church, but as a wicked woman steeped in blood. He invaded Naples in 1381, captured her, and confined her in a fortress. There, in 1382, Joanna met her end, strangled to death, just as Andrew had been decades earlier. Her life ended in the same silent violence that had marked the beginning of her reign. So was Joanna truly guilty? Historians still argue. Some see her as a victim of political slander, her reputation destroyed by ambitious men who used the deaths of her husbands as weapons against her. Others believe she may indeed have ordered Andrew's killing, desperate to free herself from his looming claim to the throne. In the brutal logic of medieval power, removing a rival, even a husband, was not unthinkable. What is clear is that Joanna became a symbol of female danger, a queen whose name was forever linked with poisoned goblets and strangled kings. To her enemies, she was a murderess who cloaked herself in royal robes. To her defenders, she was a capable ruler smeared by those who could not accept a woman on the throne. To later generations, she became legend, the queen whose husbands died too soon, whose reign was written in both power and suspicion. In the flickering light of history, Joanna of Naples stands not only as a ruler, but as a reminder of how thin the line was between rumor and reality. Perhaps she killed, perhaps she was framed. But in either case, she bore the weight of her husband's deaths, her crown forever glinting with the shadow of the bedchamber. In the summer of 1835, a small Norman village was rocked by a crime so brutal that it would be remembered long after the details faded. A young man named Pierre Rivière, barely 20 years old, murdered his own mother, his sister, and his younger brother with a billhook. What followed was not only horror at the act itself, but fascination with the strange, articulate confession he left behind. A document that made him one of the most infamous killers of rural France. Pierre was the eldest son of a poor farming family in Arnay-sur-Odon. His household was marked by bitterness and strife. His parents quarreled constantly, and Pierre grew up caught between a father he idolized and a mother he increasingly despised. He came to see her not as a parent, but as the source of the family's misery. Over time, his resentment deepened into something darker, an obsession with ending her life. On June 3, 1835, Pierre carried out his plan. While his father was away, he attacked his family with a farmer's billhook, a tool sharp enough to hack through wood and bone. His mother, his sister Victoire, and his younger brother Jules were all killed in the frenzy. Only one sibling, a younger sister, escaped alive. Pierre fled into the countryside, but soon after he surrendered himself to the authorities. The killings alone were enough to shock the nation, but what set Pierre apart was the written confession he produced while in custody. Over dozens of pages, he explained his motives with an eerie calm. He described in detail the long resentment he held against his mother, the way he believed she had wronged his father, and his conviction that killing her and those closest to her was a kind of justice. He wrote not with the fever of madness, but with the measured tone of a man who had thought deeply about what he was doing. This confession fascinated doctors, judges, and intellectuals alike. Some saw it as proof of insanity, a mind consumed by delusion. Others read it as a chilling example of rational evil, a young man who knew exactly what he was doing, who simply chose to act on impulses most would suppress. For the emerging field of psychiatry, Rivière became a case study, debated in journals and classrooms for years afterward. His trial in 1836 drew intense attention. Witnesses spoke of his odd behavior, his withdrawn manner, his fascination with religion and death. The defense argued that he was insane, that no sane man could butcher his family in such a way. The prosecution countered that his calm confession proved the opposite. He had planned the crime carefully and thus bore full responsibility. The verdict was death. Pierre was sentenced to the guillotine. Yet even in this, his story took an unusual turn. Before the execution could be carried out, King Louis Philippe commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. Perhaps it was the eloquence of his confession, perhaps the debate over his sanity. Whatever the reason, Pierre was spared the blade. But prison did not become his refuge. In 1840, just a few years into his sentence, Pierre was found dead in his cell, having hanged himself with a makeshift rope. His life ended by his own hand, as grimly as it had begun. What lingers about Pierre Rivière is not only the horror of the act, but the unsettling clarity of his words. His confession has been studied by historians, psychiatrists, and even philosophers as a rare window into the mind of a killer. Unlike the wild legends of werewolves or the sensational rumors of witches, here was a plain young man speaking plainly about why he destroyed his family. No sorcery, no pact with the devil, just cold reasoning, written in neat script. And in that, Pierre Rivière's story chills us still, for he shows that not all killers hide in forests or castles. Some grow up in small cottages, walk through quiet fields, and sit down to write their justifications, as if they were setting down the most ordinary truths. His legacy is not just the act of killing, but the unnerving reminder that evil can speak with the calmest of voices. Long before the medieval centuries gave birth to their werewolves, bandits, and blood countesses, the art of killing quietly had already taken root in the ancient world. Among the Romans, one name stood out so infamously that it endured in memory well into the Middle Ages: Locusta of Gaul. She was not a queen, nor a soldier, nor a thief. She was a poisoner, perhaps the most notorious of antiquity, whose methods and reputation foreshadowed the long line of female killers who would haunt later centuries. Locusta came from Gaul, but she made her career in Rome during the 1st century CE, a period of ruthless politics, when poison was as common a weapon as the sword. She was a skilled herbalist, trained in the use of plants that could heal or kill, depending on the hand that administered them. But instead of serving as a healer, Locusta became known for providing lethal drafts to the powerful poisons that could silence rivals neatly and without bloodshed. Her most infamous patron was Agrippina, the younger, mother of Nero. When Agrippina decided it was time to remove her husband, the Emperor Claudius, she turned to Locusta. The poisoner prepared a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite, laced with venom strong enough to kill. According to chroniclers, when the emperor faltered and seemed on the verge of recovery, Agrippina had him given a second dose, ensuring his death. Claudius was gone, and Nero, still a teenager, ascended the throne. Locusta's work did not end there. Under Nero, she became almost an official poisoner of the state. He used her concoctions to eliminate rivals and secure his hold on power. One account even claims he had her run a kind of poison school, training others in her deadly art. The image of Locusta, a woman calmly distilling death in flasks while emperors plotted around her, became one of the most chilling symbols of Rome's decadence. Eventually, her fortune turned. When Nero himself was overthrown in 68 CE, Locusta was swept up in the chaos. The new regime had no use for her talents, and her reputation was too dangerous to ignore. She was executed, though the details of her death vary. Some say she was publicly displayed and strangled, others that she was torn apart as a warning. yet her legend did not die with her. Medieval chroniclers, fascinated by tales of Rome, preserved her memory as the archetype of the poisoner. To them, she was proof that women with knowledge of herbs and chemistry could wield terrifying power, turning the tools of healing into silent weapons. In a world that often linked poison with witchcraft, Locusta stood as the ancestor of figures like Alice Kyteler and Christina of Bruswick. What sets Locusta apart is how openly her talents were employed. She was not a hidden killer, skulking in shadows or whispering spells in kitchens. She worked for emperors, her poisons altering the course of Roman history. In a sense, she was as much a political actor as the men she served. Each dose she prepared carried the weight of power struggles, dynasties rising and falling on the strength of her hand. Her story also reveals a truth that echoes through centuries. Societies may fear blades and armies, but often it is the unseen dangers, the sip of wine, the bite of food, that shape destinies. Locusta turned that truth into a career, and though she lived and died long before the medieval killers we've been exploring, her name lingered like a stain, a reminder that murder could be as simple as a herb stirred into a cup. In the candlelit imagination of later ages, Locusta of Gaul became almost mythic. The poisoner supreme, the woman whose shadow reached from the palaces of Rome into the courts and kitchens of medieval Europe. Her legacy is not just in the deaths she caused, but in the archetype she created, the deadly woman with knowledge too dangerous for her time, a figure both feared and whispered about for centuries afterward. In the late 1600s, the Austrian town of Murriazel became the stage for one of the strangest cases in Europe. A man who claimed not only to have made a pact with the devil, but to have been driven to the edge of murder by it. His name was Christoph Heisman, a struggling painter whose descent into terror blurred the line between madness, possession, and crime. Heisman was a widower when his troubles began. Poor, sickly, and unable to support himself, he later claimed that in his desperation, he had made a pact with the devil. In exchange for worldly success, he had promised his soul. Unlike the whispered stories of sorcerers and witches, Heisman's pact was written, literally. He said he had signed 2 contracts, one in ink and one in blood. The torments that followed him were described in vivid detail in the chronicles of the time. He claimed that demons appeared to him in visions, hounding him night and day, demanding that he honor his contract. He reported being attacked, thrown about, and driven nearly mad by their presence. Villagers and clergy alike saw him convulsing, crying out, or falling into trances. In 1677, Heisman traveled to the shrine of Murriazel, a famous pilgrimage site in Styria, Austria, to seek deliverance. There, in the presence of priests, he underwent exorcisms. What happened next became one of the most talked about episodes of the century. Heisman said that during the ritual, the devil himself appeared, furious, demanding his due. The priests ordered Heisman to renounce the pact, and according to the story, he physically vomited up the contract he had written in blood. The priests took it, burned it, and declared him freed. But the story did not end there. Heisman relapsed, tormented by further visions. Again and again, he claimed the devil returned to him, demanding his obedience. He drew paintings of these encounters, grotesque images of demons, contracts, and his own tormented face. Some of these paintings survive, preserved as eerie testaments to his state of mind, though his case was remembered as one of demonic possession. What makes Heisman's story belong in the gallery of killers and near killers is the way he described his temptations. In his confessions, he admitted that the devil drove him not just to despair, but to thoughts of murder, to strike down others, or himself in service of his infernal master. While no record proves he carried out killings, his testimony revealed a man teetering on the edge, haunted by urges he believed were not his own. The authorities treated him with a mixture of horror and fascination. To the priests, his case proved the reality of Satan's power and the necessity of the church's exorcisms. To later generations of doctors and scholars, it became an early study of mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia, perhaps epilepsy, perhaps the terrible weight of grief and poverty expressed through the language of demons. Highwayman lived on for several years after his exorcisms, continuing to paint and to wrestle with his visions. He died in 1700, leaving behind not only his strange confessions, but the unsettling images he sketched of his tormentors. To his contemporaries, he was a man who had walked too close to hell. To us, he appears as a fragile soul, his madness shaped by a world where the devil was as real as the sky overhead. What lingers about Christoph Highwayman is the way his story sits between categories. Part killer in intention, part victim of his own mind, part legend shaped by the fears of his age. He reminds us that not all murderers of the past left behind piles of bodies. Some left behind warnings, trembling on the edge of violence, their stories preserved not in bloodstains on the ground, but in ink and paint that still chills the eye centuries later. The medieval traveller faced dangers beyond wolves and weather, on the winding roads of England, where forests pressed close and villages lay miles apart. The real terror often came from men who lived by ambush. Among these, one name was spoken with dread: Maccus, a highwayman whose robberies turned habitually into killings, making him one of the earliest recorded serial murderers on England's roads. The records that mention Maccus are scattered, more folklore than formal chronicle. He is said to have lived in the 12th century, a time when England's roads were little more than dirt tracks, where travellers journeyed in small groups for safety, but even numbers were not always protection. Maccus and his band struck swiftly, emerging from thickets or hillsides, overwhelming victims with violence. Most robbers of the period took money and fled. Maccus was different. He had a reputation for killing even when it wasn't necessary. Merchants found with slit throats, pilgrims stripped and left for dead, peddlers gone missing only for their bodies to be discovered in shallow ditches. Over time, his cruelty turned robbery into terror. Villagers near his roots began to speak of him less as a man than as a curse on the roads. His hideouts, according to stories, were caves and hollowed hills near the old Roman ways. From there, he and his men watched for travelers carrying packs or wagons. Some tales claim he mutilated bodies to sow fear, leaving them as warnings that the roads belonged to him. Others say he buried them secretly, his band thriving on spoils while families far away wondered why their sons and fathers never returned. The crown took notice. Safe passage for merchants was vital to the king's coffers, and repeated disappearances along trade routes could not be ignored. Sheriffs raised hue and cry, summoning men to hunt Maccus down. But the forests offered cover, and for years he evaded capture, his name spreading across shires like smoke from a fire. His downfall, as legend has it, came through betrayal. One of his companions, weary of the killings or eager for royal favor, revealed his hiding place to the authorities. A band of armed men surrounded the outlaw's lair, catching him unprepared. The fight was brief, the end inevitable. Maccus was brought to trial, not a long proceeding, but a swift condemnation. Robbery alone might have earned hanging, but his record of murder demanded spectacle. He was executed by hanging, his body left on a gibbet by the roadside he once ruled. For weeks, travelers passed beneath the blackened corpse, a grim reminder that even the fiercest outlaw met the king's justice in the end. And yet his name endured. Long after his body rotted away, people spoke of Maccus's Road, a cursed stretch where ghosts of travelers were said to wander. Parents frightened children with his story, warning them never to stray from safe paths. In some corners, his tale blurred into folklore, with claims that his spirit still ambushed the unwary, demanding tolls from beyond the grave. What makes Maccus's story stand out is the way it reflects a transitional moment in medieval crime. He was not a knight turned traitor, not a noble caught in scandal, not a witch condemned for sorcery. He was a common man who turned the roads into hunting grounds, repeating his violence so often that his memory became legend. In a world where justice was slow and travel perilous, men like Maccus embodied the darkest fear of all, that death might come not from fate, but from the hand of another human waiting in ambush. So his story lingers, half history, half legend. Maccus the Highwayman, who turned England's roads red, who killed for gain, but also, it seems, for cruelty. He reminds us that medieval killers were not always cloaked in castles or rituals. Sometimes they waited on the roadside, hidden by brambles, their knives ready, their hearts already hardened. Not all medieval killers lurked in forests or crept along lonely roads. Some wore armor, carried banners, and held authority from kings and dukes. One of the most notorious was Peter von Hagenbach, a knight whose brutal rule over the town of Breisach in Alsace turned him into one of history's earliest recorded war criminals. Born in 1420 in Alsace, Hagenbach served as a vassal of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Charles was ambitious, determined to expand his territories across the fractured patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire. Hagenbach became his enforcer, a soldier of fortune tasked with keeping newly conquered lands in line. Where diplomacy failed, Hagenbach's iron hand followed. In 1474, he was appointed governor of Breisach, a strategic town on the Rhine. From the moment he arrived, his reputation for cruelty deepened. Chroniclers describe a reign of terror, arbitrary executions, extortion, and assaults on the townsfolk. He forced heavy taxes, seized property, and used violence to silence opposition. Women were said to have been assaulted by his men at his command. Even church protections were ignored. What set Hagenbach apart from ordinary harsh governors was the sheer scale and relentlessness of his brutality. Witnesses later claimed he carried out massacres, ordering soldiers to cut down civilians and hang prisoners without trial. His killings were not random acts of war, but repeated, deliberate measures to instill fear and secure obedience. To the people of Breisach, he was not a protector, but a predator wearing the badge of authority. Eventually, the weight of his cruelty sparked rebellion. The townspeople of Breisach, aided by Swiss and Alsatian allies, rose against Burgundy's forces. Hagenbach was captured alive, a rare fate for a hated commander. His trial became extraordinary, not just for its content, but for what it represented. In May 1474, in the town of Breisach itself, Peter von Hagenbach was tried before a tribunal of 28 judges, drawn from across the region. The charges against him were sweeping: murder, rape, perjury, and acts of tyranny against the laws of God and man. What shocked observers was the argument used by his defense. Hagenbach claimed he was only following the orders of his duke. The court rejected it. For perhaps the first time in recorded history, a man was told he bore responsibility for atrocities, regardless of command. His obedience to Charles the Bold did not excuse his crimes. He was guilty not merely as a soldier, but as a human being who had chosen cruelty again and again. The verdict was death. On May 9, 1474, Hagenbach was taken to the scaffold. Stripped of his knighthood, he was beheaded before a crowd that had suffered under his rule. His execution was not only punishment, but also a warning. Even nobles, even knights, could be held accountable for mass killings. Hagenbach's story is often cited as an early example of crimes against humanity being prosecuted, centuries before Nuremberg or The Hague. But for the people of Breisach, it was simpler. They had lived under the shadow of a killer who wore authority like armor, and at last they saw justice done. What makes his case stand out in our journey through medieval killers is the fusion of power and cruelty. Gilles de Rais, killed in private chambers, Peter Stumpp on lonely roads, Sonny Bean in hidden caves. Hagenbach killed with armies, with law on his lips and blood on his hands, proving that terror could flow as easily from the throne as from the shadows. And so his memory lingers, not as a bandit, not as a werewolf, but as a knight whose sword was turned against the very people he was meant to rule. In the flickering light of history, Peter von Hagenbach stands as both a murderer and a grim precedent, the man who could not hide behind the excuse of orders when the weight of his victims cried out for justice. In the rugged hills of 18th century Serbia, when the land lay under Habsburg rule, a strange terror swept through villages, the fear of the dead returning to prey on the living. At the center of this outbreak was the figure of Arnold Powell, a former soldier whose name became inseparable from Europe's vampire lore. Powell was a man hardened by war, In life he was said to have fought in Ottoman lands, where he first encountered tales of vampirism. According to local legend, he confessed that he had once been attacked by a vampire, and fearing infection, had sought protection by smearing himself with the blood of the creature and eating soil from its grave. Yet despite his precautions, he feared that the curse clung to him. He returned to his home village near Belgrade, where he tried to live as a farmer. But in 1726, Powol died suddenly, some say from a fall, others from illness. Within weeks of his burial, villagers reported eerie sightings, Powol wandering at night, pale and restless. Soon afterward, people began to die. Victims complained of being throttled in their sleep, their bodies drained of strength, their deaths swift and unexplained. Panic gripped the community. The villagers exhumed Powol's body, and what they found confirmed their fears. His corpse, though buried for weeks, showed little decay. His skin was fresh, his nails long, his mouth smeared with blood. In the eyes of the people, there was no doubt, Powol had become a vampire. The response was brutal and ritualistic. His body was staked through the heart, his head severed, his remains burned to ash. To be certain the curse ended, they did the same to several others, thought to be infected by him. For a time, the village breathed easier, but the fear did not die. A few years later, another outbreak of deaths occurred in the same region. Once again, villagers claimed vampires walked among them. Reports of strange corpses and nocturnal attacks drew the attention of Habsburg officials. In 1732, a military commission was dispatched to investigate, and their findings, carefully recorded, spread across Europe. The commission described in detail the exhumation of bodies said to be vampires. Some corpses were swollen with fresh blood, others looked as though they had only just died. The officials concluded, to the astonishment of Enlightenment Europe, that vampirism might be real. Their report was published widely, fueling a wave of vampire hysteria that reached as far as Paris and Vienna. Arnold Powell's case became the most famous example, his name etched into the chronicles of supernatural crime. Though today we see it as folklore shaped by fear of disease and misunderstanding of decay, to his contemporaries Powell's was a murderer from beyond the grave. He was the soldier who returned not to defend his village, but to drain it, one victim at a time. What makes Powell's story so striking is how it transformed a single death into a collective panic. Unlike solitary killers who struck in secret, Powell's legacy spread like contagion, each death attributed to his restless spirit. He became a symbol of how communities in the pre-modern world explained sudden illness and unexplained mortality, not with germs or infection, but with the hand of the undead. Even now, his name lingers in studies of folklore. Powell's was not merely a peasant legend. His case was investigated, documented, and debated by scholars of the Enlightenment. He stands as one of the few vampires whose crimes were treated as fact by the authorities of his time. In the candlelight of history, Arnold Powell is remembered not as a soldier of war, but as a soldier of the grave, a man whose death gave birth to one of Europe's most enduring fears. In 17th century Italy, whispers spread through Rome, Naples, and Palermo of a woman who sold death as easily as perfume. Her name was Giulia Tofana, remembered as the creator of Aqua Tofana, a poison so subtle and effective that it became legendary. Unlike the wild bandits or blood-soaked werewolves of earlier tales, Giulia's killings were elegant, domestic, and deliberate. She gave women the means to murder quietly, and in doing so became one of the most notorious poisoners in Europe. Giulia's origins remain shadowy. Some say she inherited her trade from her mother, herself executed for poisoning. Others suggest she was a skilled apothecary who saw opportunity in desperation. What is certain is that by the mid-1600s, Giulia had perfected a recipe that blended arsenic, lead, and belladonna into a clear, tasteless liquid. To disguise it, she bottled the poison in small vials, labeled as cosmetics or devotional oils, often with the image of Saint Nicholas on the front. It looked harmless, even holy. In reality, it was lethal. The brilliance of Aqua Tofana lay in its subtlety. A few drops slipped into soup or wine did not kill immediately, Instead, it mimicked the slow decline of natural illness. The victim grew weak over days or weeks, wasting away while no suspicion fell on the hand that served their meals. To neighbors and physicians, it seemed like fever, consumption, or another common malady. To the widow who remained, it was liberation. Julia's clientele were often women trapped in marriages they could not escape. In an era when divorce was nearly impossible and abusive husbands wielded near total power, Aqua Tofana offered a grim form of freedom. With it, women could quietly remove the men who dominated their lives and reclaim their dowries, their futures, their very lives. Some used it for wealth, others for love, but always the method was the same: a gentle poisoning, a husband coughing himself into the grave while his wife wore black and received condolences. Over the years, Julia's network expanded. She worked with a circle of women who helped distribute the poison. Each vial passed discreetly from hand to hand. Rumors say hundreds of men died in this way, their deaths marked not by violence, but by silence at the dinner table. Inevitably, suspicion grew. By the 1650s, authorities had caught wind of the quiet epidemic of unexplained deaths. Julia was arrested in Rome, though she at first escaped capture by taking sanctuary in a church. But eventually, she was seized and interrogated. Under pressure, she confessed that her poison had been used to kill more than 600 men. Her trial was a sensation. In a city already obsessed with scandal, the revelation that noblemen, merchants, and husbands of standing had fallen victim to a vial, passed across a kitchen table, horrified the public. The court condemned her as both poisoner and witch, her concoction treated as evidence of a pact with the devil. In 1659, Julia Tofana was executed, along with several of her accomplices. Yet her legend did not die with her. Aqua Tofana became a name spoken across Europe, feared by husbands and coveted by wives. Writers of later centuries, including Mozart himself, repeated the tale that he had been poisoned with her formula, though history offers no proof. To this day, the name Tofana carries an aura of lethal elegance. What sets Julia apart from other killers of her era is the social dimension of her crimes. She did not stalk roads or wield swords. She sold her skill to others, empowering a hidden rebellion of women against the men who controlled their lives. Her poison was not just death in a bottle. It was a weapon of the powerless, turned against the powerful, in kitchens and bedrooms across Italy. And so, Julia Tofana remains a figure both feared and strangely admired. To some, she was a monster who profited from murder. To others, she was a dark liberator, giving women the only escape they had in a world that denied them choice. In either case, her legacy is unmistakable. A vial, a drop, a cough in the night, and another man carried silently to his grave. In the market town of Oakham, England, in the year 1684, a quiet scandal unfolded, one that would end at the gallows. The name at its center was Elizabeth Ridgway, remembered as a wife who turned to poison not once, but many times, leaving a trail of suspicion and death. Elizabeth was an ordinary woman by appearance, married to Thomas Ridgway, a laborer of modest means. Yet beneath the calm surface of domestic life, something darker stirred. Her neighbors noticed Thomas's health, failing in strange ways, fits of pain, sudden weakness, violent sickness after meals. At first it was thought to be natural, perhaps some fever or misfortune of diet. But as the days stretched into weeks, and Thomas wasted away, whispers began to circulate. The truth was revealed only after Thomas's death. Elizabeth was accused of having slipped poison into his food and drink, deliberately weakening him until his body could endure no more. What shocked the community was not just the act itself, but the suggestion that this was not her first attempt at murder. Rumors spread that she had experimented with poisons before, testing their effects, refining her methods in secret. At her trial, the evidence was damning. Witnesses recalled her purchases of arsenic, a substance readily available in the 17th century for pest control, but infamous for its misuse. Neighbors recounted her cold demeanor, her lack of grief at her husband's decline. Some claimed she had confessed openly, boasting that she could rid herself of any man who displeased her. The court found her guilty, and her sentence was death. On March 24, 1684, Elizabeth Ridgway was executed by hanging. The crowd that gathered to watch her end was not only drawn by the spectacle of justice, but by the fascination that poisoners always inspired, women who killed not with knives or brute force, but with powders slipped silently into a cup. Elizabeth's case was part of a larger pattern in 17th century England. Poisonings were deeply feared, precisely because they blurred the line between home and battlefield. Anyone could be a victim, a husband eating supper, a guest sipping ale, a child taking medicine. Unlike the open violence of sword or gun, poison was hidden, intimate, impossible to guard against, without mistrusting those closest to you. Her execution served as a public warning, yet her name lived on in local lore. For years afterward, the people of Oakham spoke of Elizabeth Ridgway as an example of domestic treachery, a woman who turned the sanctity of marriage into a death sentence. What makes her story chilling is its ordinariness. Elizabeth was not a noble plotting for power, not a bandit lurking on the roads, not a sorcerer claiming the devil's aid. She was a wife at her husband's table, serving meals with one hand and death with the other. In a world where households were meant to be places of trust and safety, she transformed her kitchen into a place of fear. Her legacy reminds us that some of the most unsettling killers in history did not look like monsters at all. They wore aprons, smiled across the table, and waited patiently for their victims to swallow the fatal mouthful. Elizabeth Ridgway's name endures as one of these, a quiet woman whose hands held the power of life and death, and who chose again and again to let the poison speak. Hungary in the 16th century was a land divided, its nobility locked in endless struggles for wealth, land, and power. Among its aristocracy, one name emerged, not for political triumphs, but for brutality: Countess Erzsébet Szobor, whose reputation was stained with acts of cruelty, so extreme that she earned a place in the same grim company as Elizabeth Báthory. Szobor was born into one of Hungary's great families. Through marriage, she became lady of vast estates, wielding the authority that came with noble rank. But where some nobles used their power to foster loyalty among their peasants, Erzsébet ruled through fear. Chroniclers and local testimony describe her as a woman of violent temper, one who beat, tortured, and sometimes killed those who displeased her. Servants lived in terror. Stories spread of brutal punishments for even the smallest mistakes: a dropped dish, a garment not cleaned to her liking, a word spoken out of turn. Victims were said to be whipped until blood ran, burned with irons, or locked without food until they starved. Some never returned from her chambers at all. Unlike the carefully plotted poisonings of Julia Tofana or Elizabeth Ridgway, Szobor's violence was immediate, physical, and often public. Her cruelty was not hidden in whispers, but displayed as a reminder of her authority. The peasants who lived under her dominion came to see her not as a lady of the manor, but as a tyrant cloaked in silks. Her notoriety grew after her husband's death. Alone she ruled her estates, with even harsher measures, unchecked by any softer influence. Complaints piled up, though few dared to voice them openly. In an age where nobles were rarely held accountable for the suffering of peasants, her actions went unpunished. Still, rumors circulated beyond her lands, spreading the image of a woman whose cruelty seemed boundless. When she died in 1566, her passing brought a measure of relief to those who had lived in her shadow. But death did not end her story. Her memory was carried forward in local tales, her name linked forever with violence. In later centuries, her reputation would intertwine with that of Elizabeth Báthory, another Hungarian noblewoman remembered for bloodshed. Some even suggested that Szobor's example set the stage for Báthory's excesses, a lineage of cruelty passed through noble houses. What makes Erzsébet Szobor's case striking is how it exposes the vulnerability of peasants under feudal rule. For all the talk of justice and divine order, the simple truth was that a noble woman with a violent temper could kill with impunity. No court came to the aid of her servants. No trial recorded their suffering. Her legacy survives only in scattered accounts, in the fear she left behind. In this way, Chabot represents a different kind of medieval killer. Not the outlaw hunted in forests, not the werewolf tried in panic, not the poisoner weaving subtle plots. She was a noble who turned everyday power into a weapon, whose household became a place of torment. Her story lingers in Hungary's dark folklore, as one more reminder that cruelty often wears fine clothes. The peasants who whispered her name after her death did so with both relief and dread, knowing that while she was gone, others like her would surely rise. Though centuries separate the medieval world from the modern one, some killers seem to step straight out of its nightmares. One of the most infamous was Peter Kürten, a German murderer whose reign of terror in the late 1920s earned him the name the Vampire of Düsseldorf. His crimes shocked a city struggling with the aftershocks of war and economic collapse, and they carried echoes of medieval fears: blood drinkers, prowlers in the night, beasts disguised as men. Kürten was born in 1883 into a violent household in Cologne. Abuse shaped his childhood, and early cruelty to animals hinted at the violence that would follow. As a young man, he drifted into petty crime and served repeated prison sentences. But behind the bars of his mind, darker impulses grew. By the time he was free in the late 1920s, those impulses had hardened into murder. His crimes began quietly: assaults, attempted strangulations, but soon escalated. In 1929, Düsseldorf was gripped by panic as a series of brutal killings unfolded. Victims ranged from young children to adults. Some were stabbed repeatedly, their bodies mutilated. Others were strangled or bludgeoned. What horrified the city most was Kürten's confession that he sometimes drank the blood of his victims, savoring it as if he were a creature out of legend. Newspapers seized on this detail, and the name vampire was born. For months, Düsseldorf lived in fear. The city at night became a place of locked doors and whispered prayers. Police flooded the streets, but Kürten proved elusive. He blended easily into crowds, appearing as an ordinary man, polite, soft-spoken, even charming. Yet beneath the surface lay a predator who seemed to kill not for profit, but for the pleasure of it. Eventually, his crimes betrayed him. A young woman who survived one of his attacks reported him to the police, leading to his capture in 1930. What followed was one of the most sensational trials of the century. Kürten confessed in chilling detail, describing how killing gave him a sense of power and fulfillment. He admitted to at least 9 murders and dozens of other assaults, though some believed the true number higher. The courtroom was transfixed. Here was a man who seemed outwardly ordinary, yet who spoke of bloodlust with the detachment of someone describing the weather. His calm words horrified his listeners more than rage ever could. In his demeanor, Kürten recalled the unsettling composure of earlier killers like Erasmus of Nuremberg, whose confessions centuries before had chilled their audiences in the same way. He was sentenced to death, and on July 2, 1931, Peter Kürten was executed by guillotine in Cologne. In a final act that startled even his guards, he asked whether he would be able to hear his own blood spurting from his neck after the blade fell. A last morbid fascination with the sound of life draining away. Kürten's crimes belonged to the modern world, but the fears they stirred were ancient. A city terrorized by a night-stalking killer who drank blood could just as easily have been a medieval village whispering of werewolves or vampires. His case showed that even in an age of electric lights and modern police forces, the old terrors still walked among us, not in the shape of beasts, but in the minds of men. What makes his story endure is not only the brutality of his acts, but the way they forced people to confront a timeless truth, that evil does not vanish with progress. The vampire of Düsseldorf was no supernatural creature, yet his crimes carried the weight of folklore, reminding the world that some legends are born not in imagination but in blood. In the turbulent landscape of 13th century Italy, where rival city-states and noble families vied for dominance, one man's name became synonymous with terror: Ezzelino III de Romano. Unlike the hidden poisoners or highway killers of our journey, Ezzelino's murders were writ large across battlefields and city walls. He was not a predator in the shadows, but a warlord who turned whole towns into graveyards. Ezzelino was born in 1194 into the de Romano family, lords of territories between Verona and Treviso. From youth, he proved ambitious, shrewd, and ruthless. His rise to power came through alliances, first with the Ghibelline faction that supported the Holy Roman Emperor against the papacy, and later directly under the protection of Emperor Frederick II. As Frederick's lieutenant in northern Italy, Ezzelino was granted sweeping authority. It was a trust he would wield with unmatched brutality. Contemporary chroniclers paint him as a man with no pity. When towns resisted his rule, he responded with massacres. In Verona, Brescia, and Padua, his forces executed not only soldiers but civilians. Men, women, and children were cut down or imprisoned in droves. Reports speak of thousands slaughtered, of prisoners starved to death en masse, of whole families exterminated simply for belonging to the wrong faction. One of the darkest episodes came after his capture of Friola in 1239. Accounts say he ordered more than 10,000 people killed or condemned to dungeons where they perished in filth and darkness. In Padua, he had hundreds of nobles chained and cast into pits, their cries echoing until starvation silenced them. To his enemies, he seemed less a man than an instrument of death, his cruelty systematic and relentless. Ezzelino himself cultivated the image of fear. He dressed simply, ate sparingly, and spoke rarely, as if he were beyond ordinary human pleasures. But when violence was called for, he unleashed it with cold efficiency. His soldiers followed suit, carrying out his commands with merciless precision. In this way, he ruled not by love or loyalty, but by terror. Even the church branded him a monster. Pope Alexander IV called him the son of perdition and compared him to Antichrist himself. Preachers told tales of his atrocities as moral warnings, proof of what unchecked ambition could unleash. When Frederick II died, leaving Ezzelino without imperial backing, the papacy moved swiftly to destroy him. In 1259, a coalition of Italian cities rose against him. At the Battle of Cassano d'Adda, Ezzelino was finally defeated. Wounded and captured, he was offered the chance to live if he repented. He refused, starving himself rather than submit. After 3 days of agony, he died at the age of 65, his body broken but his legend secured. To his enemies, he was a demon in human flesh. To his allies, he was a necessary weapon against papal influence. To history, he stands as one of the bloodiest rulers of medieval Italy. Unlike killers who hid their crimes, Ezzelino murdered openly, transforming war into slaughter and leaving behind cities scarred by his hand. What makes his story so haunting is the scale. Most serial killers leave trails of dozens, perhaps hundreds of victims. Ezzelino's toll ran into the tens of thousands. He did not kill in secret. He turned whole populations into examples. His cruelty was not compulsion, but policy, wielded as deliberately as a sword. And so his name endures, not in folklore or fairy tale, but in the chronicles of medieval Italy, where monks and historians alike struggle to capture the enormity of his crimes. In their pages, Ezzelino de Romano looms as a figure of almost mythic terror, a man who ruled through death and whose shadow fell across the land long after his bones were dust. In the shifting political world of 15th century Italy, mercenary captains, condottieri, rose to power through cunning, battle, and ambition. Among them, few were as infamous as Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, Lord of Rimini, celebrated by some as a brilliant soldier and patron of the arts. He was reviled by others as a murderer, tyrant, and blasphemer. His life was a study in contradictions, a man who built temples, but filled his rule with cruelty. Sigismundo was born in 1417 into the powerful Malatesta family, which controlled Rimini and other towns along the Adriatic coast. From youth he proved himself a skilled warrior, leading troops as a teenager and carving out influence through sheer audacity. His military prowess made him valuable to popes and princes alike, but his reputation for brutality grew as swiftly as his fame. Contemporaries accused him of numerous murders, carried out not in battle but in cold blood. Rivals, political enemies, and even family members met suspicious ends under his watch. Chroniclers claimed he ordered executions with little cause, his temper sparking into lethal violence. Women were not spared his wrath. He was rumored to have strangled a wife with his own hands, and mistresses who displeased him often vanished without explanation. Yet Sigismundo was not merely a brute. He styled himself a Renaissance prince, surrounding himself with poets, artists, and architects. In Rimini, he commissioned the Tempio Malatestiano, a church transformed into a personal mausoleum filled with classical imagery and pagan motifs. For his enemies, this blending of sacred and profane became proof of his impiety. To them, he was not only a murderer but a man who mocked God. The papacy, in particular, turned against him. Pope Pius II described Sigismundo in language usually reserved for heretics and demons. He accused him of incest, sacrilege, and countless murders. In a rare display of fury, the Pope even staged a symbolic trial in absentia, condemning Sigismundo's soul and burning his effigy in Rome. To be anathematized so thoroughly marked him as a man set apart, almost beyond the category of human sin, into something monstrous. And yet, Sigismundo survived. For decades he balanced on the knife edge of Italian politics, fighting wars for and against popes, making and breaking alliances, murdering when it suited him. His brutality was matched by his brilliance. He could not be ignored, even by those who hated him. His later years brought decline. Betrayed by shifting fortunes, stripped of lands, he died in Rimini in 1468, his ambitions reduced, his enemies triumphant. But even in death, his reputation lingered. Was he a patron of culture or a beast of violence? A soldier defending his city or a tyrant destroying it from within? What sets Sigismundo Malatesta apart from other killers of his age is the fusion of savagery and refinement. He was not the hidden outlaw of the roads, nor the supernatural werewolf of folklore. He was a lord who read poetry by day and ordered executions by night, who built temples while filling graves, who could charm scholars and terrorize peasants in equal measure. In the end, history remembers him as both wolf and man, a condottiero whose cruelty carved fear into the land, and whose ambition carried him into the chronicles not only as a killer, but as one of Italy's darkest princes. Few names from medieval Germany are as steeped in horror as Peter Stumpp, a farmer from the town of Bedburg near Cologne, whose 16th century trial became one of the most infamous werewolf cases in Europe. His story is a tangled knot of confession, legend, and terror, a chilling blend of true crime and supernatural dread. The details emerged in 1589, when Stumpp was captured after years of unexplained killings that plagued the countryside. Livestock were found torn apart, children vanished, their bodies discovered mutilated in the fields. Women traveling alone never returned. To villagers, the culprit was no ordinary murderer. They believed a werewolf prowled their land. Under torture, Stumpp confessed to being that monster. He claimed that from youth he had been obsessed with dark powers, and that the devil had granted him a magical belt. When he fastened it around his waist, he said he transformed into a wolf, strong, savage, with a hunger for flesh. In this form, he admitted to slaughtering men, women, and children alike, sometimes devouring their remains, sometimes carrying their limbs home for later feasts. The confessions grew even more grotesque. Stumpp spoke of incest, cannibalism, and pacts with demons. He described how he murdered his own son, eating his brain. He admitted to killing at least 13 children and 2 pregnant women, tearing the unborn children from their mothers' wombs. To the court, such words were beyond comprehension. To his judges, he was not merely a killer. He was the devil's own. His execution was as savage as his crimes. On October 31st, 1589, before a massive crowd, Stumpp was tied to a breaking wheel. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs shattered with iron, his head cut off. His mistress and daughter, accused of sharing in his crimes, were burned alive beside him. His body was then burned to ash, and a great wheel with a wolf's head was erected as a warning to all who might follow his path. Whether Stumpp truly committed the murders, or whether his confession was wrung from him by torture, his story reveals the raw fear of his time. In a world without the modern idea of serial killers, people explained repeated acts of murder with the only shape they knew, the werewolf. To them, Stumpp's bloodlust could not be human. It had to be supernatural. Historians debate the truth. Some argue that Stumpp was indeed a murderer, his crimes exaggerated by superstition. Others suggest that he was a scapegoat, condemned during a period of religious war and panic. His werewolf identity created to explain horrors the community could not face otherwise. What is certain is that his legend endured. Broadsheets spread his tale across Europe, painting him as a cautionary figure, the man who made a pact with hell and paid with his life. In later centuries, his name became one of the foundations of the werewolf myth in popular imagination. Peter Stumpp's case reminds us how thin the boundary was between crime and folklore. A man may have killed with human hands, but to his neighbors he was a beast, a predator with fur and fangs who stalked the night. Whether murderer, monster, or both, he became the embodiment of fear itself, the wolf in human skin. Among the darkest tales of German folklore stands the name Christman Genipperteinga, a figure whose crimes, if true, eclipse nearly every other killer of his age. Said to have lived in the 16th century, Christman was remembered not merely as a bandit or outlaw, but as a murderer of such staggering scale that his victims were counted in the hundreds, even the thousands. According to legend, Christman led a secret life in the forests of the Rhineland, operating from a fortified cave, stocked with weapons, supplies, and stolen goods. For years, he preyed on travelers, merchants, pilgrims, peasants, anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. But unlike most highwaymen, who robbed and fled, Christman was said to kill almost everyone he encountered, ensuring no witnesses remained to reveal his lair. The numbers are difficult to fathom. Chroniclers claimed he murdered 964 people over the course of a decade. Victims were ambushed, dragged into his hideout, and executed with chilling efficiency. His cruelty was not limited to strangers. Some stories say he captured women and held them prisoner, forcing them into servitude until they too met grisly ends. What terrified his contemporaries most was the scale of his operation. He was not a solitary figure, but commanded a band of followers who helped him kill and conceal the evidence. His cave, when finally discovered, was described as a chamber of horrors, bones scattered, belongings of the dead piled high, blood stains darkening the walls. To villagers, it was proof not of a mere outlaw, but of a monster in human guise. Christman's downfall came through betrayal. A prisoner, spared longer than most, managed to escape and lead authorities to his lair. Soldiers stormed the hideout, capturing Christman and what remained of his band. The trial that followed revealed the scale of his crimes. Witnesses spoke of missing relatives, merchants who vanished without trace, caravans swallowed by silence. The court, overwhelmed by the enormity of his guilt, condemned him to a death as brutal as his life. His execution was carried out by the breaking wheel, a punishment reserved for the most heinous criminals. His limbs were shattered with iron bars, his body stretched until it broke, and his remains displayed as a warning. Chroniclers emphasize that his end was slow, agonizing, a mirror of the pain he had inflicted on others. Yet historians question whether Christman Genipperteinga truly existed in the form the stories suggest. Some believe his tale was exaggerated or even invented, a moral fable meant to embody the dangers of the lawless woods. The impossibly high number of victims may be a symbolic measure, a way of saying he killed too many to count. Others argue that there may have been a real outlaw at the core of the legend, his crimes inflated by rumor and fear, until he became a near-mythical figure of cruelty. What sets Christman apart, whether man or myth, is the way his story captures a primal terror, the idea of an unstoppable predator, killing not for need, but for habit, leaving death in his wake with no end in sight. While most medieval killers were remembered for handfuls of victims, Christman was remembered for hundreds, a figure so extreme that he seemed less like a man and more like a plague in human form. His name lingers in folklore as one of Europe's most prolific killers, real or imagined. Christman Genipperteinga, the thousand-fold murderer, remains a shadow on the border between history and legend, a reminder that sometimes the darkest figures are those whose deeds defy belief itself. Few figures loom larger in the grim annals of European history than Countess Elizabeth Báthory of Hungary, whose name has become inseparable from blood, cruelty, and legend. Known as the Blood Countess, she is remembered as one of history's most prolific female killers, her crimes cloaked in both historical record and centuries of myth-making. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into the powerful Báthory family, whose influence stretched across Hungary and Transylvania. She grew up amid privilege and political intrigue, married into further wealth, and eventually ruled vast estates. But behind the grandeur of her castle walls, rumors of horror began to circulate. Servant girls, many of them peasants who came to the castle for work, began to vanish. At first, families whispered quietly. A daughter sent to serve never returned. A sister disappeared without word. But before long, the whispers grew into accusations. The Countess herself was torturing and killing young women by the dozens, perhaps hundreds. Witness testimony, gathered years later, painted scenes of unspeakable cruelty. Elizabeth was said to have beaten girls until they bled, burned them with irons, starved them or forced them to stand outside naked in the freezing snow until death claimed them. Some accounts grew darker still, that she bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth. Whether this gruesome detail was true or the product of folklore, it cemented her place as one of Europe's most terrifying figures. The number of victims attributed to her is staggering. Some claimed she killed more than 600 young women, though historians suspect the true number was lower. Still, even a fraction of that would make her among the deadliest killers in recorded history. Her accomplices, servants who helped lure and restrain victims, later confessed under interrogation, confirming the scale of her crimes. For years, Elizabeth's noble status shielded her, but as the disappearances mounted, pressure grew too great to ignore. In 1610, King Matthias of Hungary ordered an investigation. Soldiers stormed Christdet Castle, where they reportedly found fresh corpses and dying victims still imprisoned. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet because of her rank, Elizabeth was never formally tried. To execute a countess of her lineage would have been too great a scandal. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest, walled within her chambers at Sixdet Castle. There she remained for 4 years, until her death in 1614, cut off from the world she had once dominated. Her story has since become entangled with legend. The image of the Countess bathing in blood may be myth, added by later storytellers eager to cast her as a vampiric figure. But the cruelty, the torture, the sheer number of victims, these rest on firmer ground, supported by the testimonies of dozens of witnesses and accomplices. What makes Elizabeth Báthory's case so haunting is not only the brutality of her acts, but the way they inverted the expectations of her time. Castles were meant to be places of protection, noble ladies guardians of virtue. Instead, Sixdet became a house of death, and its mistress a predator cloaked in jewels. She remains, even now, one of history's darkest icons, a noble woman whose thirst for control, whether rooted in vanity, sadism, or madness, left rivers of blood behind her. Elizabeth Báthory was not an outlaw in the forest or a monster of folklore. She was a countess, ruling from stone towers, whose cruelty rivaled and perhaps surpassed any killer of her age. And with her, our gallery of medieval and early modern killers closes, a procession of outlaws, poisoners, tyrants, and predators, each leaving their mark on history's shadows. But none so enduring, so infamous, as the Blood Countess, whose name still drips with the weight of horror, Elizabeth Báthory,